And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
The world is on the brink of an economic revolution, and everything could change right before our eyes. As the world's largest superpower, the US has long not only controlled global financial flows, but also kept its currency, the dollar, at the center of the world economy. But now China, America's biggest competitor, is boldly challenging the dollar and all the established rules. Imagine what would happen if China successfully replaced the dollar with its own currency, the yuan. This is not just an economic move, it is a real threat to US dominance on the world stage.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
The Chinese economy is growing stronger, and its actions in recent months point to something much bigger than just an economic dispute. China is gradually reducing its financial transactions in dollars, giving priority to the yuan, which calls into question the entire system of international trade agreements. And if China continues in the same vein, it could lead to the destruction of US currency hegemony, meaning that the dollar may no longer remain the world currency. In that case, who will control the global economy? Who will take the helm of global finance?
There's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
It should not be forgotten that with every step China takes, its ambitions become more apparent. China has already launched its One Belt, One Road initiative, securing strategic trading positions around the world. China is building its own alternative financial system aimed at strengthening the yuan's position in international trade, and this threatens many global structures, including the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. In response to these moves, the US is stepping up its economic struggle. But it faces one problem. The harder America pushes, the more decisive China's actions become.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
At the same time, China is actively increasing the use of the yuan in international trade. Already, 40% of Chinese imports and exports are conducted in yuan, which in turn reduces dependence on the dollar. But here's the big question: what happens next? Will China be able to break free from its economic dependence on the US and regain its financial independence? Or will American power, backed by dollars and the threat of sanctions, prove stronger after all? The future of the dollar order is in question, and the global economic system could change overnight. Trump is already in a panic, realizing that China could destroy the dollar's monopoly, and the world is once again entering a new, even more dangerous economic Cold War. What awaits global markets, corporations, and us? Will it be a shock for the US or another economic shift in China's favor? We will try to answer these questions in this video.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
The trade war between the US and China, which has been developing over the past few years, has reached a critical point. For several months now, China and the US have been engaged in an intense economic conflict in which currency, trade tariffs, and influence on the global economy play a crucial role. All these elements have now merged into a single mechanism that poses a threat not only to the two countries but also to the global financial system as a whole. China, as one of the leading players on the world stage, is strengthening its position every day, preparing for a complete break in economic relations with the US. Recent steps taken by the Chinese authorities are a signal that China intends to change the financial landscape, where the US dollar will no longer play a major role. One of the first and most striking examples was a decree issued to Chinese banks, requiring them to reduce their dollar transactions. In this context, it is clear that China is ready to radically change its approach to financial policy, which means a further escalation of the trade war and increased pressure on the US. These measures were taken in response to a series of US trade restrictions and tariffs. In January 2025, the US imposed tariffs on Chinese goods of up to 145%. This was a move that provoked a sharp reaction from Beijing. The US insisted that these measures were aimed at protecting the domestic market and preventing Chinese economic aggression. However, this came as no surprise to China. China's strategy was not to back down or give in to US pressure. On the contrary, Beijing went further, introducing measures aimed at tighter control of global trade and finance. The People's Bank of China initiated another step aimed at preventing currency speculation and strengthening the domestic currency, the yuan. This decision led to a reduction in dollar transactions by Chinese banks and an increase in the use of the yuan in international trade. China was not just defending itself, it was beginning to form a new economic model in which the dollar would be just one of many instruments, rather than the dominant one.
That's a 10. That's a good one. Yeah.
This situation opens up completely new prospects for the world. China has no intention of backing down in the trade war and is ready to fight for the future of its economy and at the same time for its financial independence. The US finds itself in a vulnerable position. The introduction of such harsh tariffs, as well as measures aimed at reducing Chinese influence in the markets, threaten the established financial system that has existed for ages. But China also understands that this is only the beginning. Its strategy to control global trade and influence currency flows will continue to evolve, and it is already clear that the consequences of this strategy will be far-reaching.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
China's next step was to respond to US attempts to control the global market, which was clearly evident in economic decisions aimed at increasing independence from the dollar. China continued to strengthen its currency, promoting the yuan as an alternative to the dollar on the international stage. The country actively supported the development and deepening of the yuan's integration into international financial systems. This is not just a political move, it is a clear signal that China is ready to take its economy to a new level and become not just a major power, but also an independent financial center. However, the most important moment in this confrontation was China's decision to reduce its dollar transactions and switch to the yuan. This caused a wave of alarm among international financial experts and large corporations operating in China. Even a number of Western banks serving Chinese markets were forced to review their business strategies. Soon, international trade contracts began to change significantly, including more yuan positions and fewer dollar transactions. The Chinese economy began to see itself as an independent entity in the global financial system. The US found itself in a difficult situation. It could not simply ignore this challenge. especially given that China was prepared to take the toughest measures to strengthen its financial system. The US position became increasingly vulnerable as the Chinese economy became more stable and ready for a prolonged confrontation. With each passing day, the pressure on the dollar intensified, and China showed that it was prepared to fight to the end, regardless of the economic sanctions and threats imposed by the US. As a result, China began to actively introduce the yuan into international markets, offering its partners favorable terms for working with its currency. China's strategy was not only to reduce its dependence on the dollar, but also to strengthen the yuan as an independent currency for international trade. This change could have far-reaching consequences for the global economy, especially if the Chinese yuan does indeed become the second currency used in global settlements alongside the dollar. All this confirms that China is ready to act decisively, not back down in the face of US pressure, and continue to strengthen its financial independence.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
China continues to work actively to strengthen its currency and achieve financial independence. In response to US pressure and the introduction of new economic sanctions, Beijing has decided to make the yuan the main currency for international settlements, significantly reducing its dependence on the US dollar. These actions are a logical continuation of China's strategy to strengthen its control over world trade and financial flows. It is expected that China will strive to make the yuan not only a regional currency but also a significant global currency capable of competing with the dollar. At first glance, this may seem like an overly ambitious step, but in fact, such changes are already actively taking place. One of the decisive steps was China's desire to completely control the yuan's exchange rate to prevent it from falling under pressure from Western currencies. The Chinese authorities have begun a series of reforms aimed at preventing volatility in the yuan's exchange rate. These measures include the introduction of new mechanisms to control market fluctuations and the creation of a new currency reserve that could serve as a buffer in the event of economic instability. In practice, this means that China is actively reducing its dependence on the dollar, not only at the level of government operations, but also at the level of commercial transactions between countries. Most of China's exports and imports are now conducted in yuan, which reduces the overall volume of transactions in dollars. As a result, this creates a stable financial platform for China, allowing it to maneuver more freely on the world stage and build new strategic alliances. China is not only demonstrating its determination to achieve economic independence, but is also actively working to strengthen its currency. With each passing month, interest in the yuan as an alternative to the dollar is growing, which is beginning to have a serious impact on the global market.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
For the US, these changes pose a real threat. Despite attempts to regain financial advantage and ensure the dollar's leadership on the world stage, China is actively moving towards abandoning the dollar monopoly. The US is beginning to realize that the global dominance of the dollar may be under threat, which calls into question its status as the world's leading power. Over time, if China continues to introduce the yuan into international settlements, the US economy may face problems related to the depreciation of the dollar and its declining importance in world trade. Meanwhile, China makes no secret of its intentions. Beijing's leaders say that the future global economy will be built on the principles of multipolarity, where several currencies will compete for a place in international settlements. And among these currencies, of course, will be the yuan, which experts believe has the potential to become one of the world's leading currencies in the coming decades. However, to achieve this, China must resolve several important issues related to its domestic economy and financial stability. The situation is complicated by the fact that the US actively criticizes international financial organizations for their lack of effectiveness with regard to the Chinese economy. This applies to both the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. China, in turn, has already made it clear that it intends to develop its own financial institutions, which may in the future be able to compete with Western financial organizations. At the same time, China is actively working to increase its GDP, which, according to the latest forecasts, could reach $19.2 trillion by 2025. This makes China not only the world's most important economy, but also a major player in the global financial system, underscoring its ambitions.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
However, China faces a number of challenges in realizing these ambitious plans. Domestic problems such as slowing growth, an aging population, and instability in the banking sector could seriously hamper progress toward these goals. Nevertheless, China is actively seeking ways to overcome these obstacles, and its actions on the international stage indicate that it is ready for any challenges. Instead of retreating, China is stepping up its efforts to secure financial independence and expand the influence of its currency. One of the main tools for this has been the Belt and Road Initiative, which promotes Chinese investment and economic influence around the world. As part of this initiative, China is actively developing its infrastructure and trade links, improving access to international markets and promoting the yuan as a major currency for settlements. This is part of a broader strategy aimed at creating an alternative global financial ecosystem, independent of the US and its monetary policy. For the US, this process poses a serious threat. China's actions not only call into question the stability of the dollar, but also undermine US financial dominance in the global economy. Against the backdrop of these changes, the Trump administration finds itself in a difficult situation. Growing threats from China are forcing Washington to rethink its financial policy and consider the possible consequences for US companies and economies operating within the dollar order. Despite his tough stance on China, Trump cannot ignore the rapidly changing conditions of the global economy and the need to adapt to new challenges. Thus, China is not only significantly strengthening its position in the international arena, but also setting new standards in the global economy. Its ambitions to strengthen the yuan and achieve financial independence could radically change the financial landscape in the coming years. The only question is how the US will respond to these challenges and maintain its dominance in the global economy. Every day, the yuan plays a more significant role in international trade, and China is actively moving toward its goal of creating a financial system that could do without the US dollar. A key point for China is its intention to reduce its dependence on the US currency, and it is through the use of the yuan in international settlements that the country is trying to expand its influence. Already, despite US attempts to maintain the dollar's position, the yuan has firmly established itself in global markets, and its use will only grow in the future. In 2025, the Chinese authorities have set a target of 40% of the country's foreign trade being conducted in yuan. This goal seems quite achievable, given China's current position on the world stage and its efforts to expand the yuan's influence in international settlements. The Chinese initiative is actively supported by a number of countries seeking to improve economic relations with China, which is why the country continues to work on creating a more stable financial infrastructure for the yuan. Meanwhile, these changes are becoming a real challenge for the US. China is actively introducing the yuan into the global market, which threatens America's financial dominance. American economists have already begun to ask themselves, what will happen if other countries also start accepting the yuan as their main currency for settlements? Experts are beginning to discuss the possible consequences for the US economy, which could face a shortage of demand for the dollar and increased economic instability. In response to these challenges, the US continues to threaten new sanctions and tariffs, which in turn only increases tensions on the global stage. American companies are faced with a dilemma: cooperate with China or continue to maintain long-term ties with American partners. In this situation, the yuan could become not just a currency, but a symbol of a new world order in which China plays a leading role. The impact of these changes is already being felt today. Companies engaged in international trade are gradually abandoning the dollar in favor of the yuan. Chinese banks are actively promoting the yuan on the global market, and Beijing's initiatives, such as the creation of new financial mechanisms, are becoming an important factor in determining the future of the global economy. Soon, many countries around the world may be using the yuan alongside the dollar, putting pressure on the US financial system. It is noteworthy that several major economies, including Russia and the European Union, have already begun to integrate the yuan into their payment systems, strengthening China's financial position. In addition, China is actively developing its network of alternative financial institutions, which could become the basis for a global financial ecosystem without US participation. China is already creating alternative banks and funds that can compete with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. These new financial structures offer attractive conditions for developing countries and create an alternative to the dollar system. It is important to note that China is actively investing in projects to build infrastructure for its financial presence, such as digital currency and blockchain technology projects, which could have a major impact on global financial markets in the coming years. The Belt and Road Initiative, initiated by China, has already significantly strengthened its position in the international arena and has become an important part of its strategy. This project aims to improve infrastructure in Asia, Africa, and Europe, and, most importantly, it includes the use of the yuan as a settlement currency. This is a project that, according to Chinese economists, will form the basis for a new economic order in which China will play a dominant role. Soon we may see other countries, especially in the developing world, actively connecting to Chinese financial systems and using the yuan in international trade. However, these steps by China pose a serious threat to the US. With each passing day, China's influence on the global economy grows, and the US government is beginning to realize that it may lose its global position. The Trump administration is forced to respond to these changes, but the tougher the sanctions the US imposes on China, the more China strengthens its currency and deepens its financial independence. It is a vicious circle from which the US seems to find it difficult to escape. This turn of events also has serious consequences for central banks, corporations, and consumers. Global central banks, which have long followed the dollar policy, are beginning to consider a possible transition to the yuan. Forecasts show that by 2030, the Chinese yuan could account for up to 25% of all international reserves, which would be a serious blow to the dollar's hegemony. On the other hand, corporations focused on international trade are already actively revising their financial strategies, and consumers, in turn, will be forced to adapt to the new financial reality. These changes will undoubtedly have long-term consequences for the global economy. The threat of a transition to a new currency system, where the dollar will no longer play a dominant role, could lead to significant changes in international trade and in how countries and companies build their economic relationships. China, for its part, will continue to move towards strengthening the yuan, seeking to create a financial system independent of the US, which is likely to lead to significant changes in the global financial architecture in the future.